Talking about race is always difficult because it always feels so contrived, which means that we should probably talk about race more. I've slowly been watching the various critiques of products of the entertainment industries such as Girls and Django Unchained, and it's inviting me into a conversation about portraying difference in fiction. I think that the most angry critics, aka Tumblr users, dislike that a whole group of people didn't speak up earlier on in the process during the creation of a TV show, book, film, what have you. I know that we all, and including myself, think that pop culture creators should be aware of larger social issues and speak to those, certainly in subtle ways, but in ways that fairly represent the numerous voices abound. What on the surface discourages me about a lot of the conversation about Girls is that I think many people are failing to see Hannah Horvath, the character, in counter-distinction between Lena Dunham, the creator. In a scene that you find questionable or problematic, is Hannah saying this awful dialogue for a satirical reason? What's Dunham trying to show us in this scene? Like in the first season, among many of the horrible things that Hannah says, she has this really awful and awkward dialogue about AIDS, which I think highlights America's ignorance about it, and like even my own ignorance. And I think that Hannah is racist really shows us that a lot of open-minded people in America couldn't really place a time in which they interacted with a person of color and acknowledged that difference instead of whitewashing that difference. This whole conversation has taught me that in fiction, when you have a person of color, he, she, or Z should be there in a way that responds to racism, which isn't a bad thing. As for Django, I still don't have really solid opinions about the use of the N-word. I think in fiction we can't be so militant about slurs because they're just so prevalent. Disregarding historical accuracy, slurs remind us that we haven't escaped them yet, and that such pejoratives still hold their meaning today. Additionally, I think that the film is for an audience that didn't have slurs slugged at them as they were walking down the street or trying to mind their own business in racially tense areas. I don't think the film would be a pleasurable experience to older generations of color or otherwise particularly sensitive to the word people. I call this principle the N-word trigger. Finally, I just need to note that a part of this whole problem is everyone's fear of minorities representing themselves in popular formats. I don't think privileged groups realize how damaging that fear is. Like, whenever someone says, I don't like Tyler Perry movies, or Tyler Perry just needs to stop, all I hear is, I don't like when someone who looks like you, Ryan, is making films for people who look like you, starring people who look like you. And that's so saddening and awful and really discourages me as a creator. And I feel like it must be discouraging for women as creators too. For people to make such a big deal about things like Girls and Bridesmaids could be so funny and accurate and entertaining, and it makes it seem that women were incapable of doing that before. No, they weren't incapable. You criticized women to the point where they were just fine taking other jobs or making content that didn't represent fairly, or focusing all their creative attention on representing men. And it's a cliche, but I certainly think that fiction, even in its most hyperbolic state, mirrors the truth. And the truth that I'm learning from this whole conversation is that creators once were and still are audience members. And when audience members don't have access to content that portrays various groups fairly and accurately, it's detrimental to the image of those various groups in the eyes of media consumers at large, which certainly affects how we think about those different groups outside of mediated setting. There's so much more to be said about this whole thing, and I am super aware that my opinions aren't finite or law, because I'm still evolving as I learn more and more. Hopefully we propel further discussion into non-militant, honest discourse about how better to portray women and blacks and Asian Americans and sexual and gender minorities. All of us.